In this week's portrait painting tutorial, I will be guiding you along the process used to create this portrait painting here entirely in one layer. Welcome to the best ALLA PRIMA colors. And I am not sponsored to show you this, so this is all just my opinion here. As you saw there, I'm using M-gram colors, and I actually end up being able to work on this painting for 4 days before it was too dry to accept more paint. So this is going to be a very fun experiment here. So I am working with black and red as my drawing color, which turns out to be a brownish color, kind of similar to your regular everyday burnt umber. I'm working wet onto dry. This is a wooden panel that has been prepared over the course of several days with Liquitex Professional Acrylic Gesso. Once again, all materials are listed in the description box of this video for you. This painting video is 1 hour long, so go ahead and get a cup of tea or just let this play as you do your homework, or you're doing your studio painting or chores around the house, or just use it as a podcast, however you like. I am painting with a very direct approach here. However, I didn't add a active tone onto the panel. That means that the panel is completely dry, and you can see these mixtures here are not sliding on the canvas that easily. As you may have seen in the past, I have used an active tone on the canvas where there's a layer of either oil or spirits on the canvas that lets the paint slide, kind of like a charcoal drawing on pastel paper. Not the case here. This is sticking onto the surface right away, which makes the lines very difficult to move. So the goal with this start was to utilize as much of the tone of the panel as possible. The panel is toned with just a neutral gray acrylic paint. Now you see this is just paper towel that I am using to eliminate some of the excess material on the canvas. I'm not using any spirits or any thinner at all to thin out the paint. This is just the fluidity of the oil paints that you see here. Mind you, the only M-gram colors that I'm using are the primaries, yellow, red, and blue. And the blue will show up later on. So it was enough, as you see there with that yellow, it's more than enough to mix with the titanium white, that this layer that I was mixing here stayed active for 4 days. 4 days is a long time to be able to work on a painting. Mind you, if you use a medium or a solvent to change the way that the paint interacts, that is going to basically void this technique. So if you want to use a technique like this, make sure that you just use the paint. It's a little difficult to get it to move, as you will see here, because it sticks right away onto the panel, but it is a very useful approach for a prolonged alla prima painting technique. As you see here, we have covered the left side of the face, which is the side that has the light. The right side has the shadow. And we've covered it with a yellowish orangey gray color. But you can still see the tone of the panel underneath. Because this is a longer demonstration, again over the time span of 4 days, about 2 hours at the most. Some days were a lot less than that, but about 2 hours or so per painting session gives you plenty of time to make the painting more realistic or more naturalistic, or you could just call it more detailed if you want to. As you know, I don't really like the word detailed, but working on a smooth panel is going to be the best experience for you. See, even as I add the shadows, the panel doesn't quite accept the paint right away. Mind you, I'm using bristle brushes that are years old, so they are quite beat up. As you see, I'm moving the brush from side to side just to apply a very uniform passage of paint. The purpose of that, once again, is to not have too much texture on the surface. I think about painters such as Nelson Shanks or William Bouguereau that have really thin applications of paint. This is the opposite of what you would see on something like a Rembrandt. The colors are very simple. We're using red and blue to create a type of grayish purpley color in the shadow, white and orange, which is a mixture of yellow and red. But later on, I think about day 3 or day 2, I pre-mix an orange because I got tired of uh, mixing in between yellow and red and between yellow and blue. So I created a green and an orange. You'll see that later on. All the shapes are simple and easy, pretty much just like you would see me do a 30-minute painting challenge or a 20-minute painting challenge. Apologize to those of you that want me to do more of those quick painting challenges. We are going to stick with a weekly, more realistic upload for the time being, pre-recorded style. This video is edited. But the full-length video, unedited, that is, it will be a silent video, will be available for anyone that wants to watch it on my Patreon. But note that when I do upload videos like that, they will be silent. And now we're adding accents onto the features of the face. Using black and alizarin crimson creates a transparent enough color for me to use to draw with. Again, this is the same exact process that you would see me do with a short exercise. Alizarin crimson is naturally a very slow dryer, so I didn't see a need to buy the M-gram paints. Remember, M-gram paints are walnut oil based. Walnut oil is a slower drying oil than linseed oil, which is what allows these colors to stay active for so long. Later on, maybe in the next 2 videos from now, or even the next video, we'll do the opposite. We will use fast dryers to start the painting. So stay tuned for those future videos. Alizarin crimson and ivory black are ideal for these accents. These accents are very useful because it gives me a anchor point, and I can move my anchor point relative to other anchor points. So the eyes are the most important anchor points for me, and I can move anything that I need to relative to the eyes. If you are doing a commission, or if you're obsessed about the likeness, if you want a perfect likeness, I would recommend you just trace it, because the more time you spend perfectly replicating the features, the more measuring you spend perfectly replicating the features, the less you're actually looking at your model or the reference. Remember that all of these painting exercises are meant to replicate or emulate what it's like to paint from a live model. I failed to mention that the light blue on the bottom right is just white and phthalo blue left over from a previous painting session. What I do in between painting sessions is I take the paint off my palette and put it in an airtight container so that the paints don't dry on my palette. This saves me money and prevents too much paint from drying on my palette, though those of you that have worked with oil paint long enough know that that is inevitable. Now we're going in with the light of the eyes, also known as the sclera. Please note that the white of the eyes, known as the sclera, is not white. Rather, it's some kind of neutral blue. Be careful not to make it too pink or too yellow. You do not want to give your model pink eye or make them look jaundiced, so make sure to stick with a very simple gray. There is a more bluish tone next to the tear duct on the eye to the left relative to us, which contrasts the color relative to the side plane of the cheekbone right next to the corner of the nose, which is more of a pinkish color, and we have more of a yellowish hue right above the eyebrow. These are things that you can't quite see on a photo reference, so make sure to spend ample time doing self-portraits if you do not have access to live models or painting from a live model. Your total painting experience should be about as much life painting as you can possibly do and as little painting from references as possible. That's ideal, but once again, finding models to pose for you is very difficult if you don't have the resources for it. That's why I'm making these videos, to show you the methodology behind painting as if you were painting from a live model. Another thing I've noticed about these walnut oil colors is that they are much more dense, especially the cadmium yellow deep is much more dense when you mix it with the cadmium red and then neutralize it with a blue, specifically cobalt blue. The density is not necessarily referring to painting impasto or opaque, but rather the ability of these colors to maintain different values and hues within your mixtures on the palette. This is what differentiates high quality paints from low quality paints. However, you can do anything you want with low quality paints. You can make a painting with hamburger grease if you want to, but it will just be a little bit more difficult. Or a lot more difficult. I don't recommend doing a painting from hamburger grease unless you're trying to make a viral video. Now we have more of a reddish tone that goes towards the neutral. This is the 6-color palette currently, but it will expand as I create pre-mixtures. Eventually I will end up just buying a cadmium green and a cadmium orange. And that shape is exactly what I mean about the color maintaining, let's call it its integrity. It doesn't fall apart when you mix it. It is dense enough that when you mix it with another color, it maintains its value and hue. Here we are on day 2. You can obviously tell this is a different day because the color is different. You're looking at the palette and you realize that there are some extras. And yes, there are extras. There is an orange that was pre-mixed. There's the green that I was using, or that I am going to continue using, that is pre-mixed. And there's an extra blue, which is the cobalt blue. So I actually failed to mention that earlier in the video I was using just phthalo blue, a student grade phthalo blue. So my apologies. However, the yellow was still the walnut oil, and it's fascinating now to note that this still maintained its workability after 4 days. So these are very slow drying paints, very useful for extended wet on wet painting sessions throughout the week. So once again, the additions are an orange that was a mixture between yellow and red, and a green, which is a mixture between cobalt blue and cadmium yellow deep. Make sure that when you buy your cadmium red, you get cadmium red light. And be aware that the cadmium-free yellow deep from Winsor Newton is not that good. It falls apart when you mix it to try to maintain subtle tones. It falls apart. It doesn't hold its integrity. It is not a true cadmium. Sorry, but that's just what I noticed. Now you see we have added more structure onto the nose. Day 2, we spend a lot more time turning the form. The major difference between how I work in a live stream format versus pre-recorded is I have much more freedom when it comes to my decision making with pre-recorded. Therefore, my paintings are almost always better, in my opinion, when I do pre-recorded. This is how I started my YouTube channel. And if you're still listening 17 minutes in, that means you might be somewhat interested in what I'm talking about. The resolution of the paintings are just much better when I work away from live streams than with live stream. There is some cadmium green that's neutralized on the corner of the mouth as I will create that plane. I know it looks like she's making a strange kind of like the Joker kind of smile, but that's in order for me to get the plane change for the side of the mouth, as you see there. So we put in a chop, a big chop plane, and then we make it smoother. I've also transitioned into my sable brushes. These are Silverbrush Pure Red Sables. Very old. These are probably 4-year-old brushes, as you can see there. Pretty much falling apart, but they still work. Day 2, the painting is still as if I had started it a couple hours ago. Not really drying at all. Perfect for me to work into day 3. Day 2 was a little bit shorter, so I didn't really get as much time to paint that day. As you see there, I was able to leave all the paints on the palette, and everything is all right. I didn't take the paints off of the palette and put it in a container because I felt comfortable enough that my paints weren't going to dry on me. The red that we're using is alizarin crimson, and the dark color we're using is cobalt blue. You would think that it would get very purpley, but it gets closer to a dark brown. This is straight up cobalt blue, and whatever was on this palette. I don't clean my palettes for those of, or my, I do clean my palettes. I don't clean my brushes for those of you that don't know. I leave them in a container of linseed oil because small apartment life. What's interesting to note we're on day 2, so day 4, I think, we're still able to paint into the background and actually change the composition. I decide not to paint the model's hand because the way it's cropped on the canvas looks strange. It doesn't really look much like a hand when it's cropped on an 8x10 inch panel. Now that we have some of the colors of the background, we're starting to put in dark accents for the hair. If you have smoother brushes, cleaner brushes, less beat up brushes, that would be ideal. My brushes are pretty beat up, so they are shoveling paint if I apply too much pressure in the wrong direction. So that's why you see me kind of carefully scrubbing the surface. And there's your proof there that the skin tones from before are still wet as it blends right into the hair. Now once again, if you are obsessed with the likeness, if you're very concerned about the likeness, spend more time with your linear drawing or do a transfer drawing. But if you want the perfect accuracy, then just trace a photograph. Once again, that is not akin to working from life, and so I don't recommend it. Once again, these methods are to emulate what it's like to work from a live model. You can see the colors are not shoveling all that much, which is good. That'll allow us to change the background. This is still day 2, I believe. So I decided I would change the background. Here we go with an orange and blue, which gives us a nice brownish neutral skin tone that we can paint lighter skin tones on top of for the neck. Now you saw me use cobalt blue. This is, by the way, why cobalt blue is so darn expensive. It is I believe it's a single pigment, so it is, and I like buying colors that are single pigments, which is why I don't really have an orange, though I will buy one at some point in the coming weeks. But cobalt blue is a very strong color, just like cerulean blue, in terms of its opacity, but not so much with the tinting strength. So it allows you to mix with it a little bit more than something like a phthalo blue or a Prussian blue, but you can use either blue you want. And there we go, adding the light color right onto that skin tone. When you paint a live model, you will notice that the local color of the face tends to look different than the local color of the neck. Local color referring to what you can think of as the average color between one section and another. An easy way to think about it is a farmer's tan. Someone with a farmer's tan, has a different local color on their shoulder as than they do with, say, their hands or their forearm. But it's the optics of the lights that make it look that way, even if the local color is the same. It's the optics of the light. And we just put in a necklace because why not? You see that dot right on the bottom in the middle of the canvas? That dried that way. It was a mistake when I gessoed the canvas, and I didn't bother sand it. Instead, I painted right into that dot and decided I would just turn it into a necklace because why not? There's texture on it already, and it seems to be in the right place for a necklace, so why not? Now we're adding darker colors, and they fit just fine, not shoveling, and it's not struggling. That is the paint from day one. It's still not too dry, or day two. I don't know what day we're on now. I think we're on day three. I lost track, but the previous days of painting or previous day, it's not struggling. Mind you, I could have probably extended it to 5 days, but I just decided that it was done after 4 days of painting. And 4 days for a face is pretty good, especially when you have the luxury of knowing that your paint is still going to be workable. Once again, Silverbrush Grand Prix, size 4, extra long filbert, about 3 years old, never been cleaned, left in a container of linseed oil, and it still works just fine. Now we're changing the background, making it darker. This is where it shovels, and this is where I decided in the future I'm going to work on a darker tone. This is now shoveling, which is making the paint application a tad bit frustrating because I can't get the dark to be dark enough without applying a very flat or broad brush stroke. And I decided not to paint that flat dark background because I wanted more color variation. When you paint from life, you will notice that something that's jet black in a photograph is actually not jet black in real life. But for aesthetic purposes, you can paint it that way. Think about Vermeer's pearl earring painting, or any of Caravaggio's dark backgrounds. And the paint was shoveling on the left and a little bit on the right as well. As you can see there, you can still see the brush strokes. Not because of the paint, but because the canvas is too smooth, which is what I wanted anyway, a smooth canvas. Now we're mixing up some more paint, and we're going to key the lights. We're going to push the highlights. White and orange mixing with a tad bit of blue. When you work from life, especially with something like natural light, you will notice more color variation than a photograph. I keep saying working from life because I finally decided to make the trip to Baltimore from Alexandria. And again, this is 28 minutes in the demo, so if you're still watching, you might be interested in my stories. I live about an hour and a half away from where I used to paint from life when I lived in Maryland. And I decided, whatever, I'll just drive. So that's what I'm doing, and I believe it is helping me to once again see the light. Now, from a paint application standpoint, when you're working wet onto wet and you get into this level of subtlety, you want to apply your brush strokes in kind of a tapping motion. Think about a very finished pencil drawing, and you fill in a value for each little area of texture on the paper. You fill in the pores, so to speak, of the paper. If you have done a very finished drawing like that. If you have not, I highly recommend it. It's a kind of a prerequisite to painting a very finished portrait painting. if you have not done a very finished pencil drawing, graphite or charcoal, then you might want to consider doing that because you don't have to deal with the paint handling. But once again, these M-gram colors are very good. I'd say they are superior to, let's just say, other paints out there, especially the cadmium yellow deep from M-gram. Way better than the cadmium free yellow from Winsor Newton, but I do not have the cadmium yellow deep from Winsor Newton. I have the cadmium free, so I can't really compare it to the Winsor Newton. Going back to the main topic, the best colors that you can use for alla prima painting. Remember that alla prima means all at once. I've read some interesting comments that you've all made on YouTube that alla prima means one brushstroke per section, and that's the first time I've ever heard that before. Yeah, you can define it to be whatever you want. So for our purposes, alla prima means all at once or one layer. Think about Bob Ross. Bob Ross is alla prima painter. Everything is done in one layer. However, his landscapes were done in 30 minutes. We have done some portraits in 30 minutes in the past. But this one is not a 30 minutes. This one perhaps, I don't know, 4 days worth, so probably about 6 hours or so. I don't know, something like that. 6 hours for this face. So it is not something that would be applicable to a live stream format. Like I said, we're going to focus on pre-recorded anyway, but just to clarify once again, alla prima means, for our purposes, alla prima means painting wet on wet, or as it translates to all at once, which typically just means one layer. Now here's where the paints really shine. This is a dark plane that is a mixture of cobalt blue and alizarin crimson, and you can see that kind of reddish hue as it mixes with the highlight on the left or the middle lights. It applies to the surface wonderfully. It's almost like painting wet onto dry, but don't be fooled, this is all still one layer, even though it is multiple days. And what is very worth noting is that the walnut oil paints at this point, as I recall, this has been many days ago now, but as I recall, they did start to dry, as you can feel with an alkyd paint in maybe an hour, or a regular linseed oil paint in maybe 5 or 6 hours. It will start to feel a little bit thicker, going from, say, fresh out of the tube, melted butter kind of, to slightly closer to a heavier molasses. What is worth noting here is that when it does start to get a little bit dry, it makes the paint handling easier. Now just watch and observe. Remember, these clips are all real time. However, it is edited so that you see only the most important stuff rather than going back and forth for 6 hours as I change my mind from one plane to another. But see how those shapes are actually holding on pretty well. An interesting thing to think about if you don't know, once again, Nelson Shanks is my superhero. He's a painter that I look up to a lot when it comes to paint handling techniques and just the freedom of oil painting. His medium of choice was turpentine mixed with stand oil. Stand oil is a boiled linseed oil, boiled so that it doesn't yellow as much, so similar to, say, walnut oil, but a lot thicker. Stand oil is very thick. So I'm assuming that's why Nelson would mix stand oil with turpentine. That would be his medium of choice. It would slow down the drying of his colors, and he had a 22 color palette, so I'm assuming he wouldn't want them to be drying overnight. And I asked one of his teachers, one of his students, which was one of my teachers many years ago, what would he do if the paints were in between drying? And something that he said that it's ideal for the subtleties or the fine form or the fine finish. Um, so remember, Nelson Shanks, for those of you that don't know, he studied in Italy with an artist by the name Antigone, which it taught him that classical finish, but he also studied with Henry Henschel and learned all of the fine color stuff. How does this relate to this painting, and how does this help you in your painting? If you aren't aware of that stage in oil paint when it starts to dry and how you can use that for your fine mixtures and stuff like that, pay particular attention to your paint handling. And this is important for you to apply these fine finishes. If you use something like Rublev or Old Holland, highly pigmented colors, very little oil but highly pigmented, they dry faster, so you may actually feel the paint starting to have a little bit more resistance to it earlier. Each color, each mixture is going to have that kind of effect, but it's up to you to figure out when it's most beneficial for the fine finish. And this is a stage that I refer to in my online classes as the impossible subtleties, because they are seemingly impossible to perceive, and you just have to go with your knowledge of form to find these shapes, such as the tear duct. I added a little bit of light right on the corner of the tear duct. I referred to this area, it is just the tear duct, but I referred to it as kind of in a sloppy term, the meat of the tear duct. Yeah, don't quote me please, but it's just the light pink area across the tear duct area that's in the light. You don't really see it too much on this tear duct on the left, but you can see it on the one to the right. And see how we're using kind of a tapping motion, just like you would with a fine finished drawing. It's been a while since I've done a voiceover like this, so let me know in the comments what you think. Those of you that have been watching my videos for a long time, you know that the first year or the first 2 years of my YouTube career, I did only videos like this once a week, which is what I'm going back to once a week, so I have more time to do commissions and studio work and to make more finished paintings for you and to present more diverse topics, kind of like the one we're doing today. Let me know what you think. In the past, I have had complaints that I talk too much when it's pre-recorded, so I do pause from time to time. Just like that pause right there. With the final 20 minutes of this painting video, I will not cut too much out of the process. And let's see if I can make that a trend with the future uploads. Remember, I'll be uploading once a week, Saturdays, 11 a.m. Let's see if we can maintain that. So the last 20 minutes, not as much talking and no edits. Now observe the tapping motion as the paint is resisting a little bit for that tear duct, but just enough to create that subtle gradation. Very tricky to do if the paint is too slick. However, with the way that the paint is handling on this day, it's much easier. Now we're adding a little bit more form, and we're also changing up the hue closer to the blue. Remember that every plane change is a color change. There are far too many paintings that are nearly monochrome, dark brown shadows, light yellowish orangey lights. There are also far too many portraits that are purple shadows, orange in the light, red in the midtones, green underneath of the mouth. So let's see if we can strive for color variation, but not overdoing it either. Once again, these are things that you'll notice when painting from life, hopefully with an instructor that has studied with students of Henry Henchy. If you want to improve your color, seek out students that have studied in the Henry Henchy color study method. Even though it looks really different from classical realism, you will notice that it will improve your usage of color over time. And there we go, back to that tapping motion. There you go, tapping motion. And see how we're using the resistance of the paint to create that gradation. And that's actually a very difficult plane for me with most portraits. That little corner of the mouth where it starts to get slightly darker as it goes into the edge of the mouth, but then it gets lighter above and lighter below, but also darker to the left. So it's a strange plane. Now I apologize you can't see the palette. And there's that plane I was talking about. It's a difficult one. Yeah, and I can't, at least for the time being, I can't really do a 6 hour upload, but you can see in the last 20 minutes, not a lot of stuff happens here in quite a long period of time. And remember, the white that we're using is just titanium white. It's still regular, I think it's just Gamblin titanium white, not M gram. So the M gram colors were the primaries: cadmium yellow deep, cadmium red light, cobalt blue. But just those three were enough to extend the painting time by 4 days. And by the time of this voiceover, it's been 5 days. So probably could have continued working on it. But 4 days, like I said, is a good time span. See that tapping motion just like a pencil drawing. That right there is how you create soft, subtle edges. But here's the challenge. See if you can create those gradations, but also push the variation between the color from one plane to another. See how we have a maybe like a bluish green in the shadow side relative to a warm green that goes gray, or let's not say gray, but say bluish as we get closer to the mouth, then gets a little bit closer to the yellow as it goes to the top left. These are all made up. I have to make them up because they're not there on the reference, but you will see shapes like that when working from real life. But when working from reference, try to play around with those color changes. Now, what's the advantage of finishing a painting like this, or finishing a painting in this method versus layering it a different layer every day? Well, the benefit of this method is that it allows you to use a longer period of time in terms of your uh, blending from one plane to another, rather than uh, using the transparency of the color to let the layer underneath show the plane change. Both highly effective. Not saying you should choose one or the other, but there are times when you want the process to be a little bit slower. And in hindsight, if I were to do this painting again, I would have used a darker tone on the canvas. There are also advantages to using lead white for these mixtures. It can have a similar effect where it doesn't raise the value too much, but titanium works just fine. So here we are, day 4, the final day. You'll notice that the palette has been cleaned. Yes, it did start to dry a little bit on the palette, so I decided it was time to put the paints away, clean it, refresh it. And you see there is a gradation on the left of kind of warm orangey skin tones, very similar to what's already on the painting. And then there's a gray one, and then there's a pink one. And now we have an edit. So, like I said, I'm editing a little bit less, but I'm editing stuff that's kind of monotonous. So we added a darker shape to the background, and then we added a darker plane to the side of the face. You always want to paint one color next to another. Try to push the difference in hue and in chroma. between these planes across from one another. It's the easiest way to see them in comparison to each other. And you can see here, day 4, the paint is still workable enough for us to make these changes. And there we go, adding a darker tone, but at the same time using it to create a softer edge. Now this is a dark plane that leans towards the red. Another advantage when the paint stays open longer is you don't have to worry about it sinking in. When oil paints dry, they naturally sink in. That means when they dry, the oil from the layer above gets absorbed by the layer underneath. So you have to work around that. There's different ways to do that, but you don't have to worry about that when the paint stays active for a couple days. Now you could use something like a water mixable oil paint that will stay active just as long as this. My favorite brand is Cobra Talons. However, even with the Cobras, I have noticed that they don't have the tinting strength or just the I want to say the weight of them just isn't enough. I don't mean in a literal sense, but what I was mentioning earlier, when you mix a very subtle tone with the water mixables, they kind of don't really hold the integrity of the color that easily. So it makes it a tad bit more difficult to paint, kind of like working with a student grade. My Phthalo Blue is a student grade. It's an Artist Loft color. I'll soon change that with either another M. Graham or just a Winsor or Gamblin. But next week, I'm actually going to do the reverse. I'm going to work with fast dryers first and then switch to these slow dryers. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be kind of an interesting change. So just about 10 minutes left to go. I don't think there are any more edits. So just enjoy the last 10 minutes of creating plane changes, softening edges. Also notice there's no reference. It's not that I forgot to put the reference in there. If you read the text, it did say beyond the picture, which means in the final stages of a portrait painting from a photograph, I do the best that I can to not use the photograph. That is, I'm not changing anything in the drawing anymore, but rather I'm pushing the tonality and the colors further than what I see in the reference. The reference is really flat. This is why I'm very skeptical of paintings that look just like a photograph. They're very, very flat. Not the aesthetic that I want. But if that's your aesthetic, then that's your aesthetic. Just go for dark shadows and very light lights. Lots of blending in between, lots of details. Maybe paint each individual eyelash if you want to, each individual skin pore if you want to, but that's just not my cup of tea. And I probably don't even have the patience to do that. So probably not even something I'm capable of. unless I'm paid to do it. Then I'm capable of anything when it comes to oil paint. Once again, a softer transition for the hair. We're not changing anything. We're just modifying what's already there. And let's see if I can make this a habit at the finishing stages of my painting demos. Take the reference out and edit very minimal. My goal here is to show you that there is life beyond the photo, beyond the AI reference, or beyond the animation, or whatever. Painting from life, these ideas can be utilized even when you're not able to paint from life. However, I do recommend self-portraits as much as you can, or go to painting groups, even if they're just short poses. Working from life will help. And there you can see the phenomenon on the forehead where the paint is just dry enough that it allows me to create that transition with very little difficulty. And the integrity of the paint, as you see right there, holds true. That is the reddish hue that I put in between those plane changes right there. Though you can't really see it on my camera, unfortunately, but in real life, that color maintains its reddish hue. Whereas with something like a cobra talons, or with I don't know, with like a student grade color or whatever, it wouldn't hold that reddish color. It would just go gray. That's the difference between the quality of the paints. And frankly, that's not that big of an issue with something like a phthalo blue, now that I think about it. I've had the phthalo blue for a while, the student grade phthalo blue, and it didn't really bother me too much, I guess because its tinting strength is subdued relative to an artist grade. So there's a use for everything. But now you can see the smooth canvas, or panel, sorry, it's a panel. The smooth wooden panel made it possible for me to add this much sophistication in my values and to minimize glare. There's hardly any glare on the face, but you can see some glare happening on the top of the panel. Not really something I can avoid, but using a smooth panel is ideal for this kind of finish. And there you see that brownish pink still holds its integrity when you mix it with the surrounding colors. Carefully making sure though that I'm not losing that dark plane on the corner of the side of the face. And see how the paint is just dry enough that It's kind of like the molasses effect right there that allows me to blend that edge. Very little changes now. Think about a sculptor in the finishing stages. They're not going to do that much. It's kind of just polishing at this stage. Be careful not to make everything the same degree of softness. Naturally, some areas like the nose, for example, is going to be a little bit uh, sharper of a plane change with most models. Things like the eyelids as well going to be a little bit sharper, so you don't want to over soften things like the eyelids or the nose. You can also make use of a fan brush to soften certain areas. Just make sure it's a clean fan brush, ideally a very soft one. At this point, you don't want to shovel any paint around. And use a mold stick if needed to support your hand. Because at this point, you do not want to put too much pressure on the brush. And this is why in the future, I think I'll have a darker tone. So you can still see the gray underneath showing through in some areas, especially the hair and the background. So I wasn't able to get it as dark as I wanted to, which is a drawback for doing this all in one layer. And when it does dry enough to work on again, not that I'm going to work on it again after this, but if I were to work on it again, I'd probably wait a good 2 to 3 weeks. Once again, thank you all so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this portrait painting demonstration. If you want to take your online art education with me further, please check out my Patreon. Links are in the description box of this video. I wish you the very best, and I'll see you on the next one.